She built her bed inside the chimney. Northern Wisconsin, 1872. The coldest winter in 3 decades was bearing down, and every settler in the valley scrambled to seal their cabin walls before the snow buried them. Every settler except one. A Norwegian widow named Ingrid Halvorsen was doing the opposite. She was tearing her chimney apart. 6 weeks she worked alone. A mason's hammer, a wheelbarrow, prying loose the field stones she and her late husband Anders had laid together just the summer before. Neighbors slowed their wagons on the road to stare. They watched her hollow out a cavity in the south-facing flank of that massive stone column, then frame a wooden box directly inside it, fitted tight against the warm masonry, with a hinged door that latched from within. They said she was building her own coffin. They said grief had consumed her mind. They said no God-fearing woman sleeps inside a fireplace. She kept working. By the time the first hard frost split the puddles in the wagon ruts, Ingrid had completed what she called her singe cove, a sleeping cupboard embedded in the chimney wall itself, 3 feet wide, 6½ feet long, 4 feet from floor to ceiling. The back wall was nothing but the masonry running from her cook stove straight up through the roof. The front, double plank pine with 2 inches of dry moss packed between the boards. The small door bore a wool-stuffed quilt nailed against its inner face. Inside that space, a feather tick laid over a straw mattress, a single oil lamp resting on a shelf, a copper pot of water that never, not once, in any weather, formed even a film of ice. Her neighbors called it the box, the burial drawer. They called her the chimney woman, and kindness had nothing to do with it. Then the second week of January, 1873 descended, and the air turned hostile to everything that breathed. A high-pressure system slid south from the Manitoba Plains and settled over the St. Croix Valley. It stayed for 9 consecutive days. The thermometer on the porch of the Township General Store read 42 degrees below zero on the 3rd morning, 43 below on the 4th. Water froze in pails sitting 3 feet from lit cook stoves. Window glass cracked in its frames from the difference between inside and outside. Cattle stood dead on their hooves in barns where the chinking had failed. Pastor Knutson, riding circuit between 3 small congregations, took frostbite to his nose so deep that the tip blackened and fell away. Families burned through 6 weeks of seasoned firewood in 9 nights and still woke to find their bedclothes stiff, frozen by the condensation of their own breath. Ingrid Halvorsen, inside her box, slept in a cotton shift. Her copper pot stayed liquid. Her thermometer, hung on the inside of the alcove door, registered 71 degrees at dawn on the worst morning of that 9-day siege. The thermometer in her main room, 15 feet away with a fire still burning in the same chimney, read 18 degrees above zero. 53 degrees of difference, separated by nothing more than 3 feet of stone and an inch of pine. What did this Norwegian widow understand about heat, about stone, about the slow, patient breathing of fire, that her neighbors, with all their pride and all their lumber, had completely failed to see? If stories like this one speak to you, where quiet knowledge outlasts loud certainty, take a moment to subscribe. More accounts like this are waiting, and your support keeps them coming. Ingrid Halvorsen had been 43 years old when Anders died of pleurisy in early spring of 1872. 3 years they had worked that claim together, clearing the first acre on the high ground above the river. She buried him beside their stillborn daughter, beneath the lone bur oak at the eastern edge of the cornfield. For 3 weeks after, she did not speak a single word that anyone in the township could recall hearing. She continued the spring planting, fed the 2 milk cows and the 7 chickens. She walked the half-mile to the well twice each day, a yoke across her shoulders, an oak bucket hanging from each end. But she did not visit the general store. She did not attend services at the small, white-painted Lutheran church that the Norwegian and Swedish families of the valley had finished raising the previous autumn. When she finally descended from that hill in the 2nd week of May, Ingrid walked into Olofsson's store, carrying a list penned in precise schoolhouse script. First item, 20 pounds of fire clay mortar. Second, 3 pounds of mason's lime. Third, a 6-pound mason's hammer. Old Olofsson, who had known Anders well, who had wept without shame at the funeral, studied that list over the rims of his spectacles. He asked Ingrid, with all the gentleness a Norwegian shopkeeper could summon, whether she intended to build something. She told him she meant to rebuild her chimney. Olafsson reminded her carefully that the chimney had gone up only 2 summers prior, drawing properly, shedding water, giving no trouble at all. Ingrid agreed this was so. Then she counted out her coins, collected her goods, and walked out without another word. The following Sunday, 3 women from the valley climbed the hill to see what she was about. They found her perched on a makeshift scaffold, 2 sawhorses, 3 planks, dismantling the chimney from the outside, stone by stone. Each piece she lifted free went onto a canvas sheet, arranged in the exact pattern it had held in the wall, a map of its own undoing, so she could put it back together precisely if she chose. The women asked why. Ingrid dragged the back of her wrist across her cheek, smearing mortar dust, and said only that the chimney would be doing more work than before. More work required a different shape. The women left. They told their husbands. The husbands shook their heads over their evening pipes and concluded that grief did peculiar things to a woman with no menfolk to steady her hand. What Ingrid was doing, and what no one in that township possessed language for, because no one had grown up where she had grown up, was rebuilding her chimney as a pismer, or something near to it. In the high valleys of Telemark, where she had drawn her first breath, the central stone hearth and chimney mass of a stuga was never merely a passage for smoke. It was the structural and thermal heart of the entire dwelling. It held the morning fire's warmth deep into the following dawn. It dried the soaked wool socks of men stumbling in from the timber. It coaxed the bread dough upward on the hearth bench. And in the oldest houses, the ones raised by her grandfather's grandfather, that broad stone flank sheltered a sleeping cupboard pressed directly against the warm masonry. The smallest child, the oldest grandparents, the worst nights of January and February. Ingrid herself had slept in such a cove at 7 years old, the winter her mother died. She remembered that stone wall against her spine as the first warmth that ever felt like the world whispering an apology. Her plan, drawn in pencil on the back of a sugar sack, pinned to the inside of her front door, called for the chimney mast to widen by 16 inches along its south face, the side running against the interior wall of her main room. Into that expanded mass, hollowed and lined with smooth pine boards, would nestle the alcove. The bed within, 3 feet wide, 6½ feet long. Its rear wall would be the chimney stone itself. The front wall facing the room would consist of 2 layers of tongue and groove pine, separated by a 2-inch cavity. That cavity she planned to fill with dried sphagnum moss, harvested from the bog at the foot of her hill. The same moss her grandmother had packed into the millhouse seams back in Telemark. Dry sphagnum traps still air the way a bird's breast down traps it, and still air does not rob heat the way moving air does. She began the chimney work in the 3rd week of May. She did not finish until the 2nd week of October. The masonry alone consumed her through all of June and July. She had to enlarge the firebox of her cook stove surround so that more heat would soak directly into the chimney stones rather than fleeing up the flue. She had to install what her father had called a roycom, a smoke channel, a baffled passage forcing hot exhaust gases along a longer route through the masonry mass before reaching the open flue. Surrendering more of their warmth into the stone with every turn, this final adjustment demanded more precision than anything else in the whole construction. If she miscalculated the baffle dimensions, smoke would pour back into the room. Or worse, on a windless night, the chimney would refuse to draw entirely, and carbon monoxide would collect in her cabin like silent poison. Her only guide was her father's handwriting. 3 folded sheets covered in his cramped Nynorsk script, carried from Norway sewn into the lining of her travel trunk. Every evening she unfolded those pages under lamplight. She built a miniature smoke channel from kindling scraps and rolled birch bark. She lit a punk of pine resin inside the model and studied how the smoke moved. When it behaved exactly as her father's notes described, she transferred the design into real stone. By late July, what had started as a simple square stack, 2 feet on each side, had become something else entirely. A broad, asymmetric block, 6 feet wide on its south face, still 2 feet on the north, like a stone shoulder hunched protectively over the south wall of the main room. Inside that shoulder, where new masonry kissed old, the smoke channel ran its course. Between the channel and the open south face sat 18 inches of solid stone. This was the back wall of the alcove, the thermal battery. Every fire she would ever build in that cook stove would pour its heat into this mass, and the mass would hold it. Release it slowly through the long, frozen nights. Her neighbors pulled their wagons to a stop. They stared. They told each other, sometimes loud enough for her to hear, that the widow Halvorsen had raised a chimney so enormous you could roast an ox inside it. What kind of woman, alone on a quarter section, needed that much stone? Old Olafsson, who carried tenderness for her on account of Anders, climbed the hill twice, bearing a basket of cold ham, dark bread, and a stoneware jug of small beer. Both times Ingrid thanked him. She ate at her trestle table while he sat across from her, trying with growing bewilderment to make sense of what she was building. He left both visits shaking his head, but he did not laugh at her. For that small mercy she stayed grateful until the day she died. The alcove framing, the wooden cupboard fitted into the hollow she had left in the masonry, consumed 3 weeks of August. She used clear pine milled the previous winter at Bergstrom's water-driven sawmill, 3 valleys east. Each board joined to the next with tongue and groove cuts so precise that a single straw fiber would not slip between them. The alcove floor sat 8 inches above the cabin floor. That gap she packed with planer shavings and dry oak leaves to break the cold that crept upward through the boards beneath. The ceiling hung 4 feet above the alcove floor, too low to stand, high enough to sit against pillows and read by oil lamp, high enough to sew. The front wall, the barrier between the alcove and the main room, was the most painstaking surface in the entire structure. 2 layers of 3/4-inch pine separated by a 2-inch cavity. That cavity she stuffed tight with dried sphagnum moss, gathered by the bushel from the bog at the base of her hill. She had cured the moss on racks in the loft for 6 weeks until it crackled like old paper between her fingers. Then she packed it into the cavity in handfuls, tamping gently with a wooden dowel. Light enough to trap dead air, dense enough never to settle. Along the top of the front wall, she tacked a strip of muslin to keep the moss from creeping downward over the years. At the floor line below the cavity, she left a screened gap no wider than a knife blade, just enough for stray moisture to wick outward instead of rotting the wood from within. The door hung on 3 small wrought iron hinges, forged by the smith in the river settlement in trade for 2 hens and a setting of eggs. Double plank like the rest of the front wall, its inner face padded with a heavy wool quilt she had stitched together from worn-out blankets. When that door swung closed, no air passed between alcove and room. Not around the edges. Not anywhere. A wooden latch, nothing more than a turning peg on the inside, held the door closed against the gentle push of warm air the alcove would build on frigid nights. No window, no opening of any kind except a small, adjustable vent slot cut into the upper corner of the door. She could slide it open to draw fresh air from the main room, or seal the alcove shut against the cold. When the masonry had cured and the moss was packed tight and the door was hung in its frame, Ingrid lit a small fire in her cook stove on a cool evening in mid-October. She let it burn for 4 hours. Then she stepped into the alcove, closed the door behind her, lit the oil lamp on the corner shelf, lay down on the feather tick, and read through her father's notes one final time. The rear wall, the masonry, pressed warm against her shoulder. Not hot, not uncomfortable. Warm the way a banked stove holds warmth, the way a hearthstone radiates heat an hour after the supper dishes are cleared. She read for 40 minutes, blew out the lamp, slept straight through until dawn. When she opened her eyes, the masonry was still warm. The cook stove fire had been dead for 9 hours. That was the night she understood her father had been right about all of it. The ridicule arrived the following Sunday at church. Ingrid hadn't set foot in a service since Anders' funeral. But that morning she walked the 2 miles down the wagon road in clean, dark wool and a knitted shawl, took her old seat on the women's side of the aisle, and listened to Pastor Knutson preach from Proverbs, the verse about the wise woman who builds her house. Whether the pastor had chosen that scripture as a pointed nod to her situation, or whether the coincidence belonged to the Holy Spirit alone, Ingrid never could decide. But afterward, in the churchyard, with maple leaves turning gold and the air carrying the first honest scent of autumn, she stood among the valley women for the first time in 7 months, and she felt the silence around her harden into something colder than simple absence. Martha Bjornstad, Anders' cousin by marriage, the one who had brought casseroles during that first terrible week of widowhood, asked Ingrid how she was getting along up on the hill. Ingrid said she was getting along fine, said she had finished her cabin work before winter set in. Martha asked what work. Ingrid paused. She had not yet found a Norwegian-American word for what she had built, and she suspected, rightly as it turned out, that the English word alcove would do her no favors. She told Martha she had built a sleeping cupboard inside her chimney wall. Martha said she didn't follow. Ingrid said it was a cove, the way her grandmother had slept back in Telemark. Martha said she still didn't follow. Old Olafsen, standing close enough to overhear, stepped in to translate. He did his honest best. But the picture he managed to paint, a wooden bed enclosed within chimney masonry, did not strike the gathered women of the Skunk Creek Valley as either sensible or decent. Sigrid Tollefsen, whose husband Halvor Tollefsen owned the largest farm in the township and who regarded herself as the social conscience of the Norwegian community, turned to Ingrid and asked in plain English whether she was telling them she now slept inside her fireplace. Ingrid said yes. Sigrid asked whether the fireplace was lit while she slept in it. Ingrid said the cookstove fire was usually banked low for the night, but yes, there was generally a small fire going. Sigrid did not laugh out loud. Sigrid was a Lutheran and a respectable woman. And respectable women did not laugh in the churchyard. But her mouth tightened at the corners in a way every person present understood. Within a week, the story of the widow Halvorsen sleeping inside her own chimney had reached every farmhouse in the valley and several beyond. The names arrived fast: the coffin, the chimney drawer, the widow's box, the roasting cupboard. Halvor Tollefsen told a joke at Olafsen's store that fall, said the widow on the hill had decided to get a head start on her cremation, save her sons the trouble. Several of the men laughed. Olafsen himself did not. A young man named Erik Siversen, 22 years old and brimming with the absolute conviction that only 22 can produce, announced within earshot of his elders that any idiot could recognize the design as a death trap. The fumes from the cookstove would seep through the masonry and poison her while she slept. The alcove would choke with smoke the first time wind gusted wrong down the chimney. Older men who understood better held their tongues. Contradicting Erik Siversen on a point of common sense would have required defending the widow Halvorsen. And defending the widow Halvorsen had become, over the span of a single autumn, a position no one cared to hold in public. Ingrid heard every word. The valley was small. Gossip in a small valley moves faster than weather. She heard the names they called her. She heard the joke about her cremation. She heard Erik Siversen's confident declaration about carbon monoxide, which she found especially entertaining because she had devoted more hours to thinking about chimney draft than Erik Siversen had devoted to thinking about anything in his whole life. She heard Sigrid Tollefsen's pinched smile in the churchyard, described across 3 separate retellings, each version a little sharper than the one before. She responded to none of it. She kept attending church. She kept nodding politely at Sigrid Tollefsen in the aisle. She kept purchasing her flour, her coffee, her lamp oil at Olafsen's store. And when other women went silent at her entrance, she said good morning to old Olafsen, conducted her business, and walked out without pausing. What she did instead, in the long evenings of late October and through all of November, was test her alcove against the dropping temperatures of the season. She kept a small leather notebook, the same one she had used as a girl in Telemark to record butter yields and egg counts. In it, she noted every morning at 6 o'clock and every evening at 9 o'clock the readings of 3 thermometers. The first hung on a nail just outside her north window, where no morning sun could reach it. The second hung on the main room wall, 4 feet from the cookstove, 6 feet above the floor. The third hung inside the alcove door at the height of her head when she lay on the feather tick. Through the last week of October, when nighttime lows dropped to 15 degrees above zero, the readings settled into a pattern. Outside, 15 degrees. Main room with a banked fire, 52 degrees. Alcove with the door closed, 68 degrees. Through the first week of November, when nighttime lows fell to 4 degrees above zero, the readings shifted accordingly. Outside, 4 degrees. Main room, 47 degrees. Alcove, 66 degrees. Through the third week of November, when an early cold snap drove overnight lows to 12 degrees below zero on 3 consecutive nights, the readings held steady. Outside, -12. Main room, 39 degrees. Alcove, 64 degrees. She read those numbers by lamplight in the morning. She wrote them down in her careful schoolhouse hand. And she felt, for the first time since Anders had died, a quiet steadiness in her chest that was not grief and was not loneliness, but something closer to the feeling of a long-laid plan finally proving itself true. The mass of the chimney was performing exactly as her father's notes had promised. Through the daylight hours, when she fed the cook stove for cooking and for warmth, the heat of those fires soaked through the firebrick of the firebox, into the inner masonry, outward through the smoke channel and the mass beyond. By the time she banked the fire for the night, the entire 18-inch thick stone wall behind her bed was warm to the touch. Not hot, warm, with the patient warmth of stone that has been heated slowly and will surrender its heat just as slowly. Through the long night hours, while the cookstove fire dwindled to coals and the air in the main room cooled toward freezing, the masonry behind her kept releasing heat into that small enclosed space. The moss-packed front wall and the quilted door held that warmth in place against the much colder air on the other side. By dawn, the masonry was still warm. By the time she had her morning fire going, it was warming again. The principle was ancient enough that Romans had employed a version beneath their hypocaust floors. The Mongolian steppe people had built it into their kang beds, heated brick platforms with smoke channels running underneath. Russian peasants had woven it into their pechka stoves, which offered a sleeping shelf atop the masonry mass. The Swedes had refined it in their kakelugn, those tall, tile-faced stoves of central Stockholm that held a room warm for 12 hours on a single morning's firing. And the Norwegians of the high valleys had lived inside it, the Peismauer, the central stone mass of the old Stuga, sometimes with a senge cove built directly into its flank, where a grandparent slept warm on nights when the fjord wind howled loud enough to wake the dogs. Ingrid Halvorsen had not invented a thing. She had remembered what her neighbors had forgotten, or, more accurately, had never known. Most of them had crossed the Atlantic from coastal districts where peat was the fuel and houses sat low, or chimneys, when they existed at all, followed a different logic entirely. The Tollefsens came from the Hardanger coast, the Bjornstads from a fishing village near Bergen. The Seversons were Swedish, from the gentle pastoral country south of Stockholm, where the Kakelin graced townhouse parlors as indoor luxury, not as survival armor for mountain farmers. None of them had grown up inside a Peismauer house. None had slept in a cove. 600 years of stone masonry wisdom, refined through Telemark winters where January temperatures plunged regularly to 30 degrees below, that knowledge had simply not made the ocean crossing with the bulk of their community. Ingrid had carried it across in her father's notes, and in the warmth she still remembered against her 7-year-old shoulder. The first hard test of the alcove arrived in the second week of December, 1872. A 3-day blizzard descended from the northwest. Sustained winds of 35 miles per hour, snowfall measured in feet, not inches. The temperature on the first morning stood at 8 degrees above zero. By the second morning, 9 below. By the third morning, wind still screaming, snow still falling, 21 degrees below zero. The wind chill, though no one in the valley used that term in 1872, would have been measured, if anyone had thought to measure it, in survival times of less than 10 minutes for exposed skin. In the cabins along the wagon road, families spent those 3 days fighting a war they could not win. The Bjornstads burned through their entire week's supply of split firewood by the end of the second night. Martha Bjornstad spent the morning of the third day swinging an axe in the lee of the woodshed, splitting green oak that smoked far more than it burned. Halvor Tollefsen, despite the size of his farmhouse and the abundance of his woodpile, could not keep his big main room above 45 degrees, no matter how high he stoked the fire. Wind drove cold through every gap in the chinking, faster than flame could replace the lost heat. Old Olafsson, in the small back room behind his store where he lived alone, slept in his wool overcoat with boots still on. He woke on the third morning to find the inkwell on his desk frozen solid. Up on the hill, Ingrid banked her cookstove fire low and stepped into her alcove. She closed the door behind her, read by lamplight for an hour, blew out the lamp, slept under a single quilt. She woke at dawn to find the alcove thermometer reading 67 degrees. She opened the alcove door and stepped into the main room. 31 degrees on the wall thermometer. She stoked the cookstove, made coffee, ate a slice of dark bread with butter. She pulled on her overcoat, her wool mittens, her felted